Hello, everyone. Welcome back to health class. This is week 3, and I'm Nurse Karen. If you guys just finished watching the instructions video, you guys would be aware that this week's topic is the respiratory system. That's right. Okay, so let's get started right away. Let me share the PowerPoint. Okay, so like I just mentioned, we're talking about the respiratory system. In the introductory video, we did start talking about what it is and some of the parts, so don't forget what we just mentioned. The respiratory system is the part in our body that helps us breathe. And breathing makes oxygen go into our body and circulate everywhere, and it also takes out lots of toxic gases like carbon dioxide. Some of the parts that are in the respiratory system include your nose, your mouth, your larynx, which is right around here, and that's your voice box, your trachea going down a little bit, your lungs, which are the two right here in your chest, and your bronchioles, which are inside your lungs, and the alveoli, as well as the diaphragm, which is the muscle that is kind of towards the bottom of your lungs. So we did talk about that in the instructions video. So now we're going to actually go into detail to each one of those specific parts. So first, let's talk about the nose and the mouth. So what do the nose and the mouth actually do in the respiratory system? So the thing that they actually do is they allow for air to enter into your body, and this happens through both the nose and the mouth. They are both located on your face, as I'm sure both of you guys, or all of you are aware. The nose is right here and your mouth is right here. The nostrils, which are the two holes here into your nose, are what allows the air to get warm and humidified. So humidified means that the air is kind of wet and moist. And the reason you want the air to be moist is because that way it goes better through your body. There's also mucus inside your nose and also like inside your mouth and throat. And mucus is kind of like that boogery liquid, sometimes clear, sometimes yellow. It just depends, liquid that's in your nose or in the back of your throat. And this mucus, it filters particles trying to go in through your nose and mouth. So that way, large particles or little dust of specks of things don't get in. The reason you don't want these particles to get in is because they can damage the inside of your skin or the membranes that are inside of your body, and you don't want that to be damaged, as this is one of the only ways that air actually gets in through your body. So, do you guys know what's the best way to breathe? The best way to breathe is actually in through your nose and out through your mouth. So try practicing that here for a few seconds. When you're doing exercise or when you're just sitting there, breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth is always the best way to breathe, and it has a very good calming effect as well. We're going to talk a bit more about this later in the video. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the larynx. A lot of you probably have never heard of the larynx, as it's a more medical term, but one of the ways people refer to it is the voice box. So what is this larynx or voice box? The voice box is what allows you to talk. So right now, as I'm talking to you guys, the main thing that is doing this is the larynx. Another way that it might be referred to is the glottis. It really just depends who you're talking to. So when you're talking, air is passing through your throat. So when air is passing through your throat, the vocal cords, as you can see here on the picture on the right-hand side, they tend to close together and they vibrate. That vibration is what allows sounds to go through. There's also a couple other things that the larynx does. One of them is that it prevents you from choking. So when you're trying to swallow or eat food and stuff, the larynx usually won't let it pass through, and that's part of the epiglottis, which is also inside of your throat. Another thing the larynx does is it just directs air towards your lungs. So it's all a closed system that starts through your nose and mouth, and then the air goes through the larynx, and then it's going to go through more parts of your body all the way until it gets to your lungs. So the larynx is another part that directs that flow. So if you're wondering where the larynx is inside your body, it's actually right here, kind of like under your chin towards the upper part of your throat. And it's actually pretty far in there, so you might not be able to feel it. It's really a lot of cartilage, so that's where that's located. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the trachea. So the trachea is the next part in your throat that comes after the little larynx. Another way that the trachea is called is the windpipe. So this windpipe is basically just a tunnel that allows air to pass and go into your lungs. So it connects the larynx, which we just talked about as that voice box, to the bronchi, which is when things start to branch off. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The larynx is usually only about 4 inches long, so it's not super long. And it's usually around like this general area, so your lower neck and kind of your upper chest area. And this windpipe is also made out of a bunch of cartilage and tissue, so it's really just like a tube letting air pass through. So then the trachea will go into the bronchi and bronchioles, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. First, we're going to talk about the lungs. So the lungs are 2 pyramid-shaped organs inside your chest. Pyramid shape is basically the best way to describe them, as you can see here on the right-hand side. They aren't really any specific shape, but that's the closest that it gets. And these lungs, there's 2 of them, are protected by the ribs. So the ribs are your bones that are here in your chest. The lungs are very spongy, and they also are very elasticy and stretchy. Their color is a pinkish grayish, depending on where you're looking at it. So the main point of the lungs is for oxygen to get in and carbon dioxide to get out of your body. So the lungs will expand and contract depending on whether they're getting filled with air or if they're puffing the air out. The bronchioles and alveoli, which I was talking about, are actually inside of these lungs. So as you can see here on the right side picture, that middle stick right there in the middle is the trachea going down. Where it starts branching off into those 2 sides of the lungs, those are the bronchi. The 2 bigger pyramid oval-shaped items on each side are the actual lungs, and those are the ones that are getting bigger and smaller. The little tree-like branches you see through them, those are the bronchioles and the alveoli, which we're going to talk about next. So the lungs right now that you see on this picture are actually breathing in and out, which is why it's showing that movement. And we're going to talk a little bit more about breathing in and out later in the video. So next, I'm going to give you a few fun facts on the lungs. So did you know lungs are actually not the same size? So the lungs on your right are actually larger than the lungs on your left. The lungs on your right have 3 lobes or parts. As you can see here on this picture, that right lobe is sectioned off into 3 parts. The left lobe has 2 parts. Here on the picture, it kind of looks flipped, but that's because we're looking at it from our point of view. On your own point of view, if you're feeling it, your right lobe would have 3 of them and your left one would have 2 of them. So the reason that your left lung is smaller is because, as we mentioned in last week's video, the heart sits in the middle of the chest, but parts of it go into the left side of your chest. So in order to make room for your heart, the lung's left lobe is actually smaller, so that both the heart and the lung can kind of fit on the left side of your chest. Another fun fact about lungs are that lungs are the only organ within the human body that can float on water. So if you guys know how to float, like this guy here in the picture you see on the screen, that's because your lungs are inflating with air and causing you to float. Okay, so now we're done with the fun facts on the lungs. So let's go back to talking about some of these body parts. Let's talk about the bronchi, bronchioles, and the alveoli, which we were talking about a little bit before. That bronchi is that tubes that's kind of split into each different lung, as you can see here on the right side. Then the bronchioles are the little tree branches that you can see actually within the different lungs. Then there's the alveoli, which are the tiny, tiny air sacs at the very tip of the bronchioles. And I know these are all a mouthful, so don't worry. You don't have to really know these too well, but I did want to mention them to you. So those tiny ducts are the bronchioles, and those are basically delivering air to your lungs. And then the alveoli, which are those little air sacs, are the ones that are doing gas exchange, which is when you're breathing air in and taking the carbon dioxide out. So that's all happening in those tiny, tiny little sacs. The one thing that's really cool about all these bronchioles and alveoli is that they have this membrane covering them that doesn't allow any liquid to go in, which is really good because you don't want to drown inside your own body from your blood or other fluids that are inside of you. So that is a very cool thing that your bronchioles and alveoli can do for you. Here in the bronchioles is actually where a lot of the breathing problems happen. So if you have asthma, that's usually a problem with your bronchioles, because usually what happens when you have asthma is that there's a little particle or a little allergen that's causing them to get very irritated and constrict. So they're squeezing up nice and tight. And when they're squeezed super tight like that, the air is having trouble actually passing through those little tubes to get to where it needs to go. So that's why you feel like you can't breathe when you have like an asthma attack. So this is where a lot of those breathing problems do happen. And it's not just asthma, there's lots of other ones too. But I mentioned asthma because I know a lot of you guys in elementary school do have asthma. So the last thing we are going to talk about is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is a muscle. This muscle actually sits below the lungs. I don't think I actually have the right picture here. So it's a muscle that would be sitting right below the lungs. It is dome-shaped and it's constantly contracting and relaxing. I'm sorry that I don't have the right picture there. I will try to add one later on to when we're doing our office hours so you guys can actually see what it looks like. But if there's something below the lungs that kind of looks like a muscle, that's the diaphragm. And it's dome-shaped, don't forget that. So this diaphragm, when it's actually contracting, it's making a vacuum effect, which is causing the air in your lungs to be pulled inside to the lungs. When it's relaxed, your lungs are actually pushing air outside of the lungs. So this diaphragm is really what's the motor, so to speak, and actually causing all the movement for this airflow, because when it's, again, contracting, it's making a vacuum effect and sucking in all the air. And then when it's relaxing, it's pushing all the air out. So to kind of demonstrate this a little bit better, we're going to talk about breathing now. So this is a really good quote. The trick to life is to just keep breathing. And this can be taken literally or metaphorically. So this literally is true because if you're not breathing, you can't live. There's no trick to life at all because you're not going to be alive. So since breathing is so important to us, how about we talk about that here? So breathing is the process of going inhaling and exhaling. So when you inhale, here's the diaphragm, which is that lower muscle below the lungs. The diaphragm is actually contracting and getting flatter, as you can see right here. Yet when you're exhaling, your diaphragm is relaxing and it's getting bigger, as you can see now, but the opposite happens with your lungs. So as you can see, even though your diaphragm is relaxing and getting bigger during expiration, your lungs are actually getting smaller. And the same thing with inhaling. Your diaphragm is contracting and getting flatter, but your lungs are getting way bigger. So these kind of work in polar opposites with one another in order to function correctly. So inhaling is when you breathe in. So let's do it again. Breathe in. Exhaling is when you breathe out. And don't forget, try to breathe in with your nose and breathe out through your mouth if possible, since that is like the best way to breathe. So now that we know kind of how breathing works, let's talk about what normal breathing rates are for most people. So it really depends on your age, just like heart rate depends on your age. So for really little kids and toddlers, their respiratory rate or breathing rate, as that is the same term, respiratory and breathing, their breathing rate is 24 breaths to 40 breaths per minute. So if you sat there and counted them for 1 minute, that's how many times they would take a breath. So they'd go, that would be 1. And then you'd count it again, and that'd be 2. So little kids tend to have way, way faster breathing rates because their bodies are still growing and getting adapted to how everything's functioning. Now, the older you get, the slower you start breathing. So you can see 4 to 5-year-olds actually breathe either from 22 breaths to 34 breaths in a minute. 6 to 12-year-olds breathe 18 breaths to 30 breaths per minute. And anyone basically above the age of 13 breathes 12 to 16 breaths per minute. And that includes most adults as well. So for you guys who are in school, will mostly be like these that are kind of circled here and dotted lines. So for you kindergartners, your guys's might be anywhere from 22 to 34. And for you older kids, your guys's should be 18 to 30. It's really hard to take your own respiratory rate because although breathing is very involuntary, so you usually don't think about it, but if you are thinking about it, you can make yourself breathe faster and slower, so that'll change what your results are. So usually the best way to figure out your breathing rate is to have someone else do it for you without you realizing it. So you could either do it by putting their hand on their chest and feeling how many times it rises and falls, or they could just watch you and see if they could see that chest happening itself. But it does take a lot of practice, and that's why nurses, health techs, doctors, and stuff are all trained in doing this. So do any of you guys know what are some things that could make your breathing faster? You guys probably know some of them, especially exercising. So just like heart rates, exercising gets your breathing a lot faster because your body is working hard, and so it needs a lot more oxygen to have the energy to do what it needs to do. A couple other things are like medications, like we talked about before, certain diseases or disorders, like we said, asthma, maybe pneumonia, other things like that, as well as your emotions. So if you're scared, you're anxious, stuff like that, you're also going to be breathing a little bit faster because you might be feeling nervous. Now, on the opposite end, there's some things that could actually make you breathe slower. So a big one is when you're sleeping and you're nice and relaxed. So you do tend to start breathing way slower and shallower when you're sleeping or when you are relaxed. Another thing that makes breathing slower is just you physically thinking about it. So if you practice doing the inhaling through your nose, exhaling through your mouth, you can start to better prepare yourself to breathe slower as well. These are only a few things out of many things that affect your breathing, but they are the ones that I did want to talk to you guys about. So that's it for this week's lessons. If you do have any questions, please feel free to join me during my office hours for your respective grade level. Every day is a different grade level, and most of them are at 2 or 1. So go into your classroom and check the whiteboard, as right there it says when the office hours are. The office hours are only 30 minutes and a great chance for you to ask questions, talk with your classmates, talk with me, hang out, and talk more about health class. If you guys can't get on during there, you have other questions that you don't want to discuss there, you can always contact me at my email, which is listed here, and my office phone number, which is listed there as well. I'm not always in my office, so you can also text that number right there to reach my personal phone, but try to leave that as a last resort, as I'm usually really good at answering my emails as well. So thank you for joining me for this week's lessons. Now that we're done, go ahead and hit that poster board on the classroom and do the activity. Thank you. Bye.